Usually on set, we got a huge red camera. It's on like a Ronin stabilizer. We're going around getting cinematic shots like this. But what if I told you you could do all that with just your cell phone? Find out how. Cinematic shots, or cinematic stuff in general, is basically dehumanizing your footage. You start breaking through to a different type of reality, something that is not in our world.
The things you got to keep in mind when getting cinematic is your composition, your dynamic range, your lighting, your movement, your sound, oddly enough, and then of course, what kind of color grading you're going to put on the footage after the fact.
How to take cool shots with your cell phone. Tip 1.
So what is dynamic range? We may have talked about this before, but we're going to touch upon it right now.
Basically, it's how bright the brightest part in your scene is and how dark the darkest part in the scene is.
Is the range of light your sensor can capture between where it's just noise, and it can't tell the difference between light and pure black noise, and pure clipped out white, because your sensor on the camera are these little cells that when light hits them, they emit voltage. And at a certain point, so much light can hit these little cells that they top out and they're just maxed out voltage saying, yeah, I'm getting all the light I can get, and then, you know, there's no more beyond that going up. And the same thing going down, where at a certain point, just the random noise of the universe is matching those few rare photons that are hitting the sensor, and the sensor can't differentiate between what's actual signal and what's just noise, aka signal to noise ratio.
We have the sky up there. As you can tell, it's pretty bright, but let's say looking underneath this chair here, this shadow here is kind of very dark. So it's basically that range of brightness to darkness.
If you think about an oil painting, artists are sitting there and they're painting everything, and the lights are usually rich in color and the shadows usually have all this detail in them. And that's because paint is effectively an infinite dynamic range canvas. So when you're getting a picture and you have that full dynamic range and you have rich detail in the shadows, and you even still get detail in the sky and the clouds, that's when things start to look very painterly. And when things start to look painterly, they start to look cinematic.
The camera that we're shooting on right here, this is the red, and it's got the Dragon sensor, which can capture an enormous amount of dynamic range. The sun could be shining in the sky, yet you can still see the shadows underneath there. However, when using a cell phone,
and as I expose for the sky to the point where you can actually see detail in the clouds, you lose out in the alleyway, it just turns black. When I expose for the alleyway so that the sensor is letting in enough light, it's letting in so much light that the sky is completely overloading the sensor. Cell phones don't have good dynamic range. What can you do about it? Tips for maximizing your dynamic range on the phone. Don't shoot against a bright background. Right now I'm getting a selfie shot of me against the sky. My face is exposed, but the sky is all clipped. Here's my shot exposed for the sky, my face, which is now just basically pure shadow. So try to avoid shooting in front of things like windows, a person against the sky, unless you're specifically going for a silhouette look. So avoid those high dynamic range situations. Tip number 2, use a reflector or a silk to minimize the dynamic range of your scene. Take, for example, the shot of me against the sky. I'm going to hold up this reflector right here, which is now reflecting the sky, and it brings the brightness of my face up. So now, if I expose for my face, the brightness of my face is closer to that of the sky. So the phone doesn't have to capture as large of a range of light. But what is a silk? A silk is basically a thin white piece of fabric that if it was a sunny day out, you could hold it up and it puts me in a shadow, but it's a very diffused shadow that doesn't completely cut the sun, it more softens the light around me. So here's my next tip. Favor your highlights rather than your shadows. Here's what I mean by that. If your phone has manual exposure, set it for the scene and then darken the scene just a touch. So what you're doing when you lower the exposure in the scene just a little bit is you're taking those highlights that might be clipped and bringing them to within range of the sensor. And everything else is becoming a little bit dark, but it's so clean that when you boost it later on in post-production, when you're doing color grading, you don't get very noisy results. It's still pretty clean looking. So that brings us to lighting. We're talking about it a little bit in dynamic range, but let's talk about it more in depth here and how to get cinematic looking shots with your lighting. The rules of lighting still apply to cell phone footage. So phones shoot on a small sensor. It means that you don't really get shallow depth of field.
that nice, smooth, blurry wash behind your actors when you zoom in.
Right now, I am in focus, and the background is out of focus, and things in the foreground are also out of focus.
The goal with depth of field usually is just to isolate your subject.
It tells you what you should be looking at. You know you're not supposed to look at the background because the background's all blurry. You're supposed to be looking at me. It also tells you that the background is far away or my hand is close to the camera. Pictures are flat, they're two-dimensional. For us to get depth out of that picture, we use things like shallow focus, movement, and lighting to separate the elements into a perceived three-dimensional space. Because you're on a cell phone and you can't make the background out of focus and you can't make objects in the foreground out of focus, you need to use lighting to separate your subject from the background and possibly the foreground. Here's how you do that. You can use an edge light to put an edge light on your subject. That will go a long ways towards separating what we're supposed to be looking at from the wash of things that are behind them. Also, either make your subject slightly brighter than the background, or make your subject slightly darker than the background. That's what they do in House of Cards. They tend to have the characters slightly darker than the background at times. This creates contrast between you and the background, or you, or your subject, whatever you're filming. Maybe it's you. This creates contrast between your subject and the background, and it separates them. Once again, because you can't do that with focus, you need to rely on tricks like lighting to do so.
Carmichael, will you lock the exposure on my face? Because I cannot see my face.
Use your manual exposure. Let's say you're filming in a dark environment and you have a little splash of light. Somebody's lit a candle or something like that. Your phone is either going to try to expose for all the darkness, causing the little splash of light to become blown out and crappy looking, or that's probably what it's going to do actually. Lots of different phones handle exposure in different ways, but the iPhone handles manual exposure like this. You touch and hold on a spot in the screen where you want your exposure and focus to be locked. Now, with it locked, AE/AF lock comes up. If I darken the screen, it doesn't try to expose. If I go to a bright spot, it doesn't try to expose. It's locked to that exposure. I can change the exposure by just dragging up and down on the screen. You will override the phone's automatic exposure, trying to guess what you want, and use your own artistry and sensibilities for lighting instead.
This is what it looks like when you use the Ronin. One cannot forget the simple rules of composition. Just because you're shooting on a phone does not mean they do not apply.
Interesting, thoughtful framing goes a long ways towards making your shots look cinematic. Play with the edges of your frame and the space within. Instead of thinking of it as a window to the world, think of it more like a 2D canvas, and you're organizing shapes and lines, colors and forms to get interesting compositions within your frame. An awareness of how these real-world three-dimensional shapes look when composed into a 2D picture is how you get nice framing. So even though you're on a cell phone, you can still get very nice, thoughtful images that are well composed. And in fact, you can push it a little bit further. Get a little pretentious. It'll look good. Don't forget about your classic framing rules. For example, the rule of thirds, where you put your subject on the line that marks a third of the frame. Or for example, the 180-degree rule, where you stay on the same line of conversation. Another example, diagonal lines. Diagonal lines tend to be more compelling to the eye than straight lines. They lead the eye to points of interest. For example, in this shot, the edge of the roof leads your eye to Carmichael and the camera. Another good rule of thumb is balance. Balance means balancing out one side of your frame with something interesting on the other side of the frame. For example, in this shot, I have Carmichael on the right, balanced by a tree on the left. You'll notice in a lot of movies, they balance out people's faces, which very much attract your eye, with a lamp or another light source, because light sources also attract our eyes. So having a light source on one side of the frame and a person's face on the other creates balance. Also, you can use imbalance to create a sense of uneasiness or tension or suspension or many other things, because it's kind of a subconscious thing. You just feel something. All right, so I could just get a shot of the plant, neat. Or I go a little more artsy with it, get something in the foreground, like this plant, and then get something in the background here, like that sky. And then, like I mentioned, pull the highlights down just a little bit. When you focus on getting foreground, midground, background in your shots, because you're shooting wide angle, it'll give your scene some depth and something interesting for your eye to bounce around on. Now we're going to talk about movement. Movement's very related to composition, because you're going to have a nicely composed shot for your starting point, and you want to have a nicely composed shot for your ending point. So movement goes a long ways to making things look cinematic, but things always move very smoothly. So you're going to want to do the same with your phone. Now your phone, it's very light. It's easy to move. Phones also generally have stabilizers built in, so if you want to do some movement just by hand, it can generally look all right. Are you trying to tell them to focus on something? Are you telling them that something is approaching? Are you trying to start on one piece of information and then move to reveal another piece of information that elevates the scene? Movement is a great cinematic language tool, and you should use it with your phones.
Just by default here, I am going to be shooting everything on hyperlapse because it provides for very smooth, steady shots and the footage looks great. And I'm going to just slowly move around this here. Sound. What is sound? I don't know. But check this out.
You might be wondering, why am I talking about sound in a video about how to get cinematic shots with your phone? Well, nothing makes something feel less cinematic than bad, roomy, reverby, distant sounding sound. You want things to sound present and close and crisp. And you can have a really bad looking movie with good sound and have it be a very cinematic movie. Because it comes down to distraction. You don't want people to realize there is somebody there shooting the scene. You want them to suspend their disbelief and think that they're watching some character that is somehow magically being seen on the screen. When you expose bad sound to the audience, you expose the process of filmmaking to the audience. It pulls them immediately out of the movie. So when you're filming on your phone, you're in luck. Phones have really nice microphones.
I mean, after all, I guess they're designed to be talked into primarily, so it makes sense that they have good microphones.
The iPhone has an algorithm that isolates human voice and boosts it in the shot, which is very, very useful. Other phones may or may not have the same hardware, depends on what you're using. So last thing I want to talk about here is color grading, and really making it pop and giving it a stylistic edge. We're shooting on the Red camera, but the raw footage on the Red camera doesn't look very good. There's fancy tools out there like DaVinci Resolve, and there's simpler tools like the color grading tools built into Premiere. But what I might recommend, unless you want to go in depth and learn something like DaVinci Resolve, which is great by the way, check out lookup tables. Depending on what editing program you're using, you can apply these to your footage and they will give it a nice, cool looking color style. And there's a whole variety out there.
So most of the footage from the phones you're seeing in this video is color graded, the Vision Colors Impulse Pack. First, we'd apply a lookup table that will flatten your image or convert it into what we call log, kind of like what you'd get out of an Alexa. The second lookup table we apply then takes that flattened image and then stretches it back out in different areas. From there, all you need to do is basic color corrections such as messing with your levels or your RGB curves. So as you can see here, we have our iPhone footage and we have our Red footage. And while you can tell they're shot on different cameras, they are very visually similar. So if you were shooting with a 60D or a DSLR of any type, or even all the way down to the smallest camera, which is a phone, don't be discouraged, because there's always a way to get the best out of every camera you have. So
thanks for watching.
That's it.
Okay. So thanks for watching, guys. I hope you learned something from this. And if you guys have any questions or things you want us to cover more in depth, leave some comments below. We read them. We actually do. Or you can tweet at us. We also read those, the tweets. We didn't want to go super in depth because that can end up doing things.
Does things. That's the big thing with things. Do you know what the difference between a wizard and a sorcerer is? So the difference between wizards and sorcerers. Wizards are bookworms and they get all their spells from books. And a sorcerer, on the other hand, is totally different. A sorcerer gets his spells and magic through, like, intuition. Which one are you? Are you guys a wizard? You gotta read the manual, or are you a sorcerer, where you just mess with all the buttons until one does the right thing?